A kind black teenager helps a lady fix her TV for free. The next day, she shows up at his house with the police. Jamal has always been a boy with a heart of gold, so when he saw old Mrs. Clark struggling to get her TV to work, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. He knew he should head home after school to take care of his siblings, but he simply couldn't ignore the lady's plea. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he said, little knowing that this simple act of kindness would trigger a chain of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Mrs. Clark, with her silver hair framing a gentle face, sighed with relief and invited him in. As Jamal worked on the TV, they engaged in a comfortable conversation. Mrs. Clark talked about her life, sharing snippets of her past with Jamal. She had been a teacher for 30 years, living her passion by teaching elementary school children. Her conversation was filled with anecdotes and funny stories from her years as an educator. She even mentioned names that Jamal knew well. He listened attentively, genuinely interested in her stories. Seeing the world through a teacher's eyes, rather than experiencing it as a student, was fascinating. "What did you teach the most?" Jamal asked. "Mostly third grade," she said with a nostalgic smile. "Those kids were always so full of life and curiosity. I've seen many of them grow up and become successful in their own paths. It's one of the joys of living in this community for so long." Jamal could imagine how rewarding it must have been to be such an important part of their lives. He thought about his own teachers and how they impacted him. It was clear that Mrs. Clark had been more than just an educator. She had been a mentor and a guide to many. After fixing the TV, Mrs. Clark offered Jamal a glass of lemonade. They sat on the porch and enjoyed the pleasant afternoon. "You know, Jamal," she said thoughtfully, "it's young people like you who give me hope for the future. Your kindness today made a big difference to me." Walking back home, Jamal felt warmth in his heart. Helping Mrs. Clark had been a simple act, but it brought joy to both of them. Little did he know that the events triggered by this act of kindness would soon take an unexpected turn and change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Jamal arrived home to the sound of laughter and the familiar clatter of dishes in the kitchen. His younger siblings, Malik among them, were playing on the living room floor, their laughter filling the house. His mother was at the stove, preparing dinner after a long shift at the hospital. The aroma of her famous chicken stew wafted through the air. It was the most comforting smell Jamal knew. "Hey, Mom," he called out, dropping his backpack by the door and heading into the kitchen. He gave his mom a quick hug. "How was work?" Mrs. Washington's face was marked by exhaustion but lit up for her eldest son. "It was a long day, but I'm managing," she told him. Jamal's days were long too. After school, he often went straight to his part-time job at the grocery store, where he stocked shelves and helped customers until late afternoon. On weekends, he mowed lawns and did odd jobs for neighbors to earn extra money. Despite the demands on his time, he never complained. He saw it as a way to support his family and ease his mother's burden. At night, after his siblings went to bed, Jamal stayed up late studying. He had dreams of going to college, maybe even becoming an engineer. The idea of making his mom proud and providing a more comfortable life for Malik motivated him to keep pushing forward, no matter how tired he felt. The next morning, the Washington household was bustling with the usual activity. Jamal was getting ready for school, helping Malik with their backpacks while Mrs. Washington prepared breakfast. The routine was abruptly interrupted by the sound of sirens approaching their street. Jamal looked out the window, his heart racing as he saw two police cars pull up in front of their house. Jamal stepped outside, and immediately the neighbors began to gather. The officers exited their vehicles, and to Jamal's surprise, Mrs. Clark stepped out of one of the cars. She looked around nervously. "Mrs. Clark," Jamal called out. Mrs. Clark's face brightened when she saw him. She walked towards him with the officers in tow. Across the fence, Jamal's neighbors whispered among themselves. Mrs. Washington came out of the house, concern etched on her face. She ushered Malik back inside and rushed to Jamal's side. "Is everything all right?" Jamal asked. Mrs. Clark seemed anxious. She said something had happened and that she needed to talk to him and his family. Once she was seated in the living room, Mrs. Clark began to explain. After he helped with the TV the previous day, she realized her wallet was missing. At first, she thought she might have misplaced it, but she couldn't find it anywhere. So she had to ask, "Did you take it?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jamal felt his stomach churn. "No, Mrs. Clark, I didn't take your wallet, I promise," he said. One of the officers tried to calm the situation. He asked Jamal to explain exactly what happened when he helped Mrs. Clark. Jamal took a deep breath and recounted the events of the previous day in detail. He described how he fixed the TV, chatted with Mrs. Clark, and then returned home. He insisted that he hadn't seen the wallet or taken it. Mrs. Clark listened intently, then said, "I don't want to believe it, Jamal. You seemed like such a nice boy, but I can't ignore the fact that my wallet disappeared right after you helped me." Jamal's heart ached. He just wanted to help, and now he was being accused of something he didn't do. He looked Mrs. Clark straight in the eyes and said again that he hadn't seen or taken the wallet. There simply had to be another explanation. The officers exchanged glances. "We'll need to search the house just to be thorough," said one of them. After Jamal's mother gave permission, the search was conducted. The officers went through each room, checking for any sign of the missing wallet. Jamal and his family watched anxiously. They knew nothing would be found, but they felt humiliated nonetheless. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers finished the search and returned to the living room. "We didn't find anything," said one of them. "We'll continue our investigation and keep you informed." News of the incident spread quickly through the tight-knit community. It wasn't long before everyone seemed to have an opinion on what had happened between Jamal and Mrs. Clark. Reactions were mixed. Some neighbors were quick to jump to conclusions. They whispered among themselves and cast suspicious glances at Jamal. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 2 doors down, was one of the first to express her doubts. "I always thought Jamal was a good kid," she said to her friend over the fence. "But you never know, do you? It's a big coincidence, him helping Mrs. Clark and then her wallet disappearing." Others, however, were more supportive and refused to believe Jamal could be involved in anything dishonest. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired mechanic who had known Jamal since he was a little boy, shook his head when he heard the news. "That boy wouldn't hurt a fly," he insisted. "He's always been helpful and respectful. This must be some kind of misunderstanding." Jamal's friends rallied around him. Marcus, his best friend, was particularly vocal. "There's no way Jamal did this," he told anyone who would listen. "He's the most honest person I know. This is just wrong." At school, Jamal's classmates buzzed with gossip. Some believed Mrs. Clark's allegation, while others staunchly defended Jamal. Mrs. Green, his history teacher, called him aside after class. "Jamal, I know this must be difficult for you, but I believe in your integrity. Keep your head up and the truth will come out." Despite the support from his friends and family, Jamal couldn't escape the feeling of being under a microscope. Every time he walked down the street, he felt the weight of judgment from those who doubted him. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly trust can be shaken. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered at the local community center for a meeting. The topic of discussion was the recent events involving Jamal and Mrs. Clark. As people expressed their opinions, the room grew tense. Mrs. Clark also attended the meeting. She looked frail and tired. She stood up to address the crowd. "I've lived in this community for a long time," she said. "I've always believed in the goodness of my neighbors. The situation with my wallet has been very distressing, but I don't want to point fingers without cause. Jamal has always been a respectful young man." Her words brought a momentary silence to the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical. The meeting ended with a resolution to support both Mrs. Clark and Jamal as the police investigation continued. It was a small step toward healing the rift the incident had caused in the community. Days passed, and the police continued their work. They interviewed neighbors and retraced Mrs. Clark's steps. The Washington family held on to hope that the investigation would eventually clear Jamal's name. Until then, they leaned on each other for support. One afternoon, Jamal was helping his siblings with their homework in the living room. Malik, who was particularly tech-savvy for an 8-year-old, was playing on his tablet after finishing his assignments. He loved exploring the internet and was always curious about the latest trends and videos. "Jamal, look at this!" Malik suddenly shouted, his eyes wide with excitement. Jamal walked over to see what had captured his brother's attention. Malik was watching a video on a popular social media platform. The video showed a group of neighborhood kids, one of them being Kevin, a notorious troublemaker. In the footage, he held a wallet and bragged about how he had taken it from an old lady. "Look at this," he boasted in the video. "I stole this wallet from that old lady. She didn't even notice." Jamal's heart raced as he watched the video. This was the proof they needed to clear up the misunderstanding once and for all. He quickly grabbed Malik's tablet and ran to show his mom. Mrs. Washington watched the video, grabbed her keys, and told Jamal to come with her. They were going to the police. When they arrived, Officer Daniels was there to receive them. They showed him the video. "This changes everything," he said. "We need to investigate further, but it looks like we've found the real culprit." The police quickly shifted their focus to Kevin and his friends. They visited Kevin's home, and his parents were horrified to learn about the video. Kevin was taken in for questioning, and it didn't take long for him to confess to stealing Mrs. Clark's wallet. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The community couldn't believe Kevin would stoop so low. Meanwhile, Jamal's name was finally completely cleared. The weight of suspicion that had hung over him for so long was finally lifted. Mrs. Clark visited the Washington home once more, this time alone. "Jamal, I can't thank you enough for what you and your family have done," she said. "I'm sorry for everything you went through." The neighborhood rallied to show their support for Jamal and his family. The exoneration not only cleared Jamal's name but also highlighted the importance of standing together in times of adversity. Mr. Rodriguez organized a small community gathering to celebrate the resolution of the incident. As the sun set on the gathering, Jamal looked around at the familiar faces. He was grateful for the lessons he had learned and the support he had received. The experience had changed him in a good way. It had deepened his empathy and strengthened his resolve to always stand up for what was right. In the weeks following the resolution of the wallet incident, life began to return to its normal rhythm for Jamal and his family. However, the impact of the ordeal lingered in the minds of everyone involved, especially Mrs. Clark. She felt a deep sense of guilt for having wrongly accused Jamal. A few days later, the Washington family received an invitation to a community gathering at the local school auditorium. They were curious and a little anxious. The room was filled with familiar faces as everyone settled into their seats. Mrs. Clark took to the stage. She held a microphone and smiled warmly at the crowd. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming," Mrs. Clark began, her voice filled with emotion. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to address something very important. Recently, I made a grave mistake. I wrongly accused a wonderful young man, Jamal Washington, of stealing my wallet. Through recent investigation, the truth has come to light, and I must apologize for my actions." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and many faces turned to Jamal with sympathy. Mrs. Clark's eyes met Jamal's as she continued. "Jamal, I deeply regret the distress and inconvenience I caused you and your family. Your kindness and integrity were evident from the start, and I let my own fears cloud my judgment." Jamal stood up, feeling a mix of emotions. The crowd watched as Mrs. Clark walked toward him. "To make amends," she said, "I would like to invite you and your family to a special dinner at my home. I hope this can be a step toward making things right." She paused for a moment and added, "I also have a small token of appreciation for you. I know this can never undo the trouble caused, but I hope it shows how much your act of kindness means to me and our community." From behind the stage, Mrs. Clark brought out a large, well-wrapped box. She handed it to Jamal with a warm smile. Jamal opened it to reveal a brand new laptop and a letter of apology. The letter expressed her sincere regret and outlined a donation to the Jamal Washington Scholarship Fund, created to support students in the community. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jamal's mother wiped away tears of relief and gratitude. Mrs. Clark then took the microphone again. "I also want to make a public announcement. From now on, I will be supporting Jamal and his family in any way I can. It's important that we come together as a community and support those who do good." As Mrs. Clark finished her speech, the room filled with applause and cheers. Jamal and his family felt a wave of relief and appreciation. The public apology and generous gift helped heal the wounds left by the misunderstanding. The evening ended with a sense of unity and closure. Jamal and his family accepted Mrs. Clark's invitation for dinner, and the evening was filled with laughter, shared stories, and newfound understanding. It was a moment of reconciliation and celebration, marking the end of a challenging chapter and the beginning of a renewed sense of community. As the sun set on the gathering, Jamal looked around at the familiar faces, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that despite the hardships, the power of kindness and forgiveness had brought the community closer together. The future was bright, not just for him but for everyone who believed in the strength of compassion and support. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe. This other video on your screen will also entertain you.